Pollination mechanism in the genus Campanula, illustrated with Campanula barbata. Pollination is a very important step in a plant's life. It will allow fertilization and the production of seeds, the start of a new generation. Bellflowers have a special pollination mechanism. The pollen is transferred from its production location to a secondary location, from where it is then gradually released as pollinators pick it up. Pollination is the transfer of pollen from the male part of a flower to the female part of a compatible flower. The male part consists of stamens. A typical stamen has a long stalk called filamen supporting a pollen-producing head called anther. The female part consists of one to many pistils. A typical pistil consists of an enlarged basis called ovary, which will produce the seeds, a stalk called style, and a tip that collects pollen called stigma. When there are several pistils, they are often more or less fused together. Most flowers are hermaphrodites, which means that the female and male functions are carried by the same flower. Usually, plants try to limit self-pollination as much as possible. A common mechanism to achieve this is self-incompatibility. But even self-incompatible plants try to avoid as much as possible to cover their own stigma with their own pollen, as this would be a waste of pollen and would seriously reduce their receptivity to compatible pollen. In order to get around these problems and increase the efficiency of pollination, many plants separate the male and female functions spatially or temporally. Being fixed into the ground and therefore unable to move around to meet other individuals, plants have evolved various strategies to ensure pollen dispersion. Most plants let either wind or insects carry the pollen from one flower to another. Bellflowers, genus Campanula, have evolved a very particular mechanism to improve the efficiency of pollination. While the flower is still closed, pollen is transferred from the anthers to the pistil. From there, it is then picked up by pollinating insects and carried to another flower. Some other members of the Campanulaceae family have pollination mechanisms which are similar to the one in Campanula or partially rely on the same mechanism. The mechanism as it is present in the genus Campanula will be illustrated with Campanula barbata, the bearded bellflower. Campanula barbata is a plant native to the Alps, where it is common, and southern Norway, where there is a small isolated population. This flower, which recently opened, has been cut open to have a better look at what's inside. Notice that the stamens have already withered. They actually wither before the flower even opens. The pollen is caught in the hair covering the upper part of the pistil. In a flower bud that is still a few days away from opening, we can see that the stamens, which anthers haven't yet released their pollen, are pressed to the style, which is covered in hair. When the anthers open, in the flower that is still tightly closed, the pollen is pressed into these hairs. Once this is done, the flower will open. In recently opened flowers, the pollen is thus trapped in the stylar hair. The stigma is still closed. As the receptive part of the stigma is on its inner side, it can't take up pollen yet. The flower is in its male phase. In older flowers, the stylar hair, as well as the pollen that was caught in it, have disappeared. The stigma is now open, here just beginning to open, and can take up pollen from visiting pollinators. In Campanula barbata, typically bees or bumblebees. This is the female phase. The nectar is hidden behind the enlarged basis of the filaments. To reach it, pollinators have to enter the tube of the bellflower. Doing so, they rub against the pistil, which is in the middle of the tube. Pollen caught in the stylar hair gets picked up by pollinators. If the flower is already in the female phase, pollen taken up on previously visited flowers can get caught by the sticky inner surface of the stigma and fertilize the flower. In order to partition the pollen among several pollinating insects and to switch to the female phase at the ideal moment, which is as soon as all the pollen has been given away, bellflowers have developed a particular mechanism. When the first pollinator enters the flower, some of the pollen that is not strongly held back by the stylar hair gets trapped in the pollinator's hair. The stylar hair can feel mechanical stimulation. They can thus detect when a pollinator takes up pollen. Mechanical stimulation of these hairs triggers their partial retraction, so that when the next pollinator enters the flower, there is again some very loose pollen that is ready to fall off onto the pollinator. This goes on until all the hairs have retracted and all the pollen has been taken away. The flower then enters the female phase by opening the stigma, allowing them to take up pollen. Usually, the male and female phases are rather well separated, but sometimes they can be overlapping. On this flower, the stamens have been removed before they release their pollen. As in the previous time-lapse, the pistil is brushed about once an hour with a paintbrush to simulate pollinating insects. If the stylar hair is not stimulated in the correct way, it will take much longer to retract, or even won't retract at all. This mechanism of releasing pollen on demand allows the flower to give each visiting pollinator an equal amount of pollen, independently of the time elapsed between pollinator visits. On a sunny day, with many pollinators flying around, all the pollen can be given away within hours. But if for some reason no pollinator visits the flower for several days, the flower will just wait before releasing more pollen.